In this episode, a dare goes horribly wrong as three young boys break into Brooklyn's Prospect Park Zoo. After sneaking inside, the boys decide to go swimming in the polar bear enclosure, leading to one of the boys' horrifying death. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying polar bear attack of Juan Perez. Welcome to Final Affliction. Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn was once on the list for the top 10 worst zoos in America. The animals were kept in small cages or in pit-style enclosures. They were offered little stimulation or environmental enrichment, but provided entertainment for the thousands of visitors that had entered its gates since the 1930s. In May 1987, just as the zoo closed up for the day, three young boys walked around its perimeter. They were on a mission, a mischievous mission that was both exciting and adventurous, but it was also dangerous. They planned to sneak into the zoo and swim around the seal moat. It was a silly dare the 10 and 11-year-olds had come up with, though it would be one that would cost one of them his life. The security team began their patrol, and the night watchman on duty paced near the zoo's entrance. But the boys had found another way in. A small hole in the perimeter fencing was just big enough for the youngsters to crawl through. They knelt down, hardly daring to breathe as they tugged at the fencing a little. Then they pulled themselves through on their tummies and stepped inside. All was quiet. A few workers remained on site, but the hustle and bustle from the visiting public had died down now. The boys made their way to the seal enclosure, but on the way, they spotted something else. Another enclosure. The polar bear exhibit. This also had a moat around it, but this one was far more dangerous. It was far more exciting for the three young boys. They dared each other to climb in and swim around the polar bear's moat. It was the ultimate challenge. The night watchman and security team were on the lookout that night, as they were every night. They had driven past the polar bear enclosure at 5:15 that evening and again at 5:45. They were due back there 2 hours later as they patrolled the park. They were aware of break-ins during out of hours and often had to chase youngsters out of the park at night. So far, none had been stupid enough to breach any of the animal enclosure fences, but that was about to change. These three boys were up for the polar bear challenge and each agreed to it. They stripped their clothes off, removing their trousers and shoes, ready for their daring swim. All three of them were giggling with excitement. They couldn't see the polar bears at the time as they were in their cave, but they knew they were in there. They just needed to scale the wrought iron fence and drop down on the other side. Then they needed to swim around the moat before climbing back out. That was the plan. It would be an excellent story to tell their friends. To have swum in the polar bear enclosure was only for the bravest of boys. 11-year-old Juan picked up all their clothes and threw them into the enclosure. There was no going back now. He began to climb the metal fence. He pulled himself upwards, scraping his hands on the bars. At the top, he managed to climb up and over the outwards pointing sharp metal points. He teetered on the top of the fence, waiting for his friends to catch him up. One of them backed down and remained on the ground, but the other scaled the fence with Juan. They looked down into the enclosure below. It was surrounded on three sides by the moat, had 8-foot iron fences around it, and was backed by a 20-foot cliff. The boys' clothes lay in a pile on the concrete. Juan dropped down, closely followed by his other friend. They were inside. They had made it. Now, the real challenge began. The dare was to swim in the moat. The two boys walked forwards, whilst their friend watched on the other side of the bars. Juan stepped into the moat, but his friend decided against it. It was too dangerous. He headed back to the fence, while Juan proceeded through the water. He half waded, half swam across to the other side. The water was cold. A shudder ran down his spine. By now, the commotion the boys had created had alerted the enclosure's residents. 1,200-pound, 540-kilogram Teddy and 900-pound, 400-kilogram Lucy. The bears stirred from their den and came outside to investigate. They lifted their heads upwards and sniffed the air. Then they turned and looked at the boys. They had been at the zoo for more than 20 years. Born in 1964 and transferred to the zoo the following year, that enclosure was all they had known. They had never encountered anyone else or anything else in their territory before, so this had come as a shock. How were they going to react in this new situation? Would their natural instincts kick in? By now, Juan had swum across the moat to the other side. He had climbed out, and when he stood up, dripping wet, he saw the enormous polar bears. The first bear did nothing. It just stood, staring at the boy. But the other polar bear reacted differently. Upon spotting the intruder, the male polar bear immediately clambered down a rocky outcrop towards the boy. It lumbered towards him with the characteristic gait of a polar bear, its head swinging slightly from side to side, its huge paws placed carefully in front of it with each step. An impressive beast, powerful and strong. Juan felt the adrenaline surging through his veins. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. He felt sheer terror as the enormous predator came closer and closer. He froze, visibly shaking where he stood. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide. Instead, the small 11-year-old froze to the spot as the polar bear lunged at him. It grabbed him in its jaws and shook him violently. His friends screamed as they watched on in horror. The boys' cries were heard by staff at the zoo. They knew something terrible must have happened. Children had been sneaking into the zoo recently, and the security guards were constantly patrolling the zoo at night. It was now 7 p.m., 2 hours since the zoo had closed, and the blood-curdling screams meant only one thing, that someone was in serious trouble. They followed the sound of the desperate cries and dialed 911. As their friend was being mauled to death, the other two boys made a run for it, two partially naked boys fleeing into the night. When the zoo staff arrived at the polar bear exhibit, they could see the male polar bear dragging Juan's body across the enclosure. The boy was limp and lifeless. Emergency services and armed officers arrived on scene. What they found was deeply disturbing. There, just outside the polar bear den, were the two polar bears. Both were growling and fighting over the remains of the boy, tussling over the body. Only his upper half was left, and they pulled at it, each trying to keep it for themselves. It was a gruesome sight. There was no hope for the boy. It was clear to the officers that he was dead. They saw the pile of clothes scattered about on the ground and the blood on the polar bear's white fur. The scene they were faced with was deeply concerning. They suspected that there might be other children inside the enclosure. They found 3 pairs of trousers, a pair of trainers, and 2 unmatched shoes inside the compound. They thought more children might be hiding inside the cave, and so made the decision to shoot the bears. It took 20 blasts from 12-gauge shotguns firing rifled slugs and 6 bullets from a .38 caliber revolver to kill the bears. Finally, they fell to the ground, quiet and still. It was a sad end to their tragic lives. Protests broke out over the killing of the bears, and the zoo came under fire, as it had done so many times before, for its lack of welfare towards the animals in its care. That very same evening, at 11 p.m., an autopsy was performed on the bears. Officers and zoo staff wanted to make sure that they had only killed one child and not any more. They didn't yet understand the whole story. When they cut the bears open, they found the remains of Juan and no one else. When the bears were dead, they scoured the enclosure to check for more bodies, just to make sure no more were found. Later, the parents of Juan's 2 friends called police to inform them what had happened. That's when the 2 boys were interviewed and were able to reveal the true horror of the story, a silly dare that went horribly, horribly wrong. Prospect Park Zoo was closed to the public a year later, in 1988. The cages and pit enclosures were completely demolished, along with most of the interior buildings. The zoo had long needed an overhaul. The conditions the animals had been kept in for more than 50 years were appalling. Empty beer cans and smashed wine bottles were strewn about some of the enclosures. The animals were injured by their inadequate housing. There were reports of staff mistreating and even killing some of the animals. And now, finally, something was being done about it. During the renovation works, The animals were rehoused across America. Then, 5 years and $37 million later, the newly named Prospect Park Wildlife Conservation Center reopened. It was the fresh start the zoo needed. The conditions the animals were kept in were greatly improved, and the center had a new focus: to educate young people about wildlife and its conservation. A positive ending to an otherwise horrible story. Juan and 2 polar bears meeting their preventable final affliction.